they are temporary in nature. We, in a sense, we have to go back to normal, classical central bank policy. We shouldn't forget that when we decided the two LTROs, the market conditions were what I described before. So when people say that the LTRO could make the banking system more dependent from the ECB, they forget that there was no interbank markets. There were no interbank markets before. They were completely clogged. So if anything, we are actually witnessing the opposite now. We see markets that are gradually reliquefying themselves. And so we will watch carefully. As I said before, these are operations that have been successful, but also are very complex in their effects. And also, one cannot deny, I mean, monetary policy cannot do everything. As I said before, governments have to do their task. They have to undertake fiscal consolidation, complete fiscal consolidation, and do the structural reforms. The banks have to, as I read in the introductory statement, they have to improve their resilience of their balance sheet, because that's essential for credit and for lending. We addressed essentially the aspects related to liquidity and funding. We cannot and don't want at all replace either the fiscal action of the governments or possible lack of capital by the banks. That's not our job.
Okay, your neighbor, Wolfgang Preußel, please.
Wolfgang Preußel, Financial Times Deutschland. Two questions, please. From a risk management point of view, do you think it is appropriate for Eurosystem central banks to prepare for the possibility of the exit of one Eurozone member, since this doesn't seem to be something totally impossible or unlikely? And secondly, we are now, I think, in the third week of the S&P without any purchases by the European Central Bank, at least on Monday, I think that was the case. Could you perhaps say if, for you, the S&P is now history of the ECB, and more generally think that engaging the S&P back in May 2010 was the right thing to do, or was it a policy mistake by the ECB? Thank you.
Thank you. On the first question, no, we don't we don't have any plan B. I often said that to have plan Bs means to admit defeat, and we don't want to be defeated. It's also conceiving, to me, it is equivalent to conceive a reality which goes beyond the treaty. So I think I guess the ECB staff knows how to manage risks, but this is not something we foresee. You are right. The S&P has been quite inactive in the last few weeks. As I said since the very beginning of my mandate, the S&P is neither eternal nor infinite.
Okay.
Thank you.
Just behind you, Ralph Atkins, please. Second rank behind Wolfgang Preußel.
Ralph Atkins from the Financial Times. Two questions. First of all, Jürgen Stark described the ECB's balance sheet today as the quality as shocking. Can you explain why he said that? I mean, he was only a few months... depends on your translation of the German.
Okay.
Schockend. Either way, what does he know that... I mean, he must know what's in the books, probably more than we do. I mean, shouldn't we be worried by comments by that, such as that, from a former executive board member? And my second question about the LTROs, the LTRO last time, something that's been picked up in the market is the idea that banks operating across Europe were actually obtaining liquidity from national central banks in individual countries so they could match liabilities and assets by country as a hedge against a possible Eurozone breakup. Is that something you observed? Thank you.
Yeah, well, I don't know exactly what Jürgen meant about that. Incidentally, he was still a board member when he voted in favor of the ELTRO, of both ELTROs. But then he left when the actual collateral was provided. So I don't know exactly. So he didn't certainly see the collateral or anything like that. So I don't know what. I think really they must have all read the Brian Blackstone's article and decided that the ratio that matters was 3.5 trillion divided the GDP of the euro area, and not 1 divided the GDP of the euro area. But I will talk to him and I will ask him what he means. The second point is what you said is, well, first let me say one thing. There's one big difference between the first and second LTRO, which I don't think I mentioned. The number of participants went up from 500 and something. Keep in mind that the average participation to the standards is something of 100 or even less on average. The first LTRO had 500 and something, and the second LTRO had 800 banks, of which 460 are German banks. And even though I should hasten to add, the overall amount borrowed by the German banks is lower, I would say much lower than the overall amount borrowed by other countries. But, and here I come to your point, comparisons by country are actually appropriate up to a point, because it's true that some banks, especially large banks, so I'm not talking about the 460, the 430 small German banks. Incidentally, I would love to read you the places, the towns, the villages where these banks are, but I cannot do that because often they would probably be the only bank in town, and so they could be recognized. But that, to me, says one thing, that this money is now closer to the small and medium-sized enterprises than it was before, which you remember was one of the reasonings, one of the arguments to involve a very large number of participants. I'm not saying that this money will necessarily go to SMEs, but it's certainly one step closer. And we have this in mind because 80% of the euro area employment depends on the SMEs. So, but going back to your point, there are some large banks that have borrowed money through their, how do you call them, avatars in different parts of the union. So that's why it's very what? I'm sorry. Yeah. So that's why it's kind of difficult to make an exact attribution of borrowings and of drawings on the facility and countries. Now, whether they do this to match their assets and liabilities in the single country, because this was one banker, actually one British banker, said that he was doing this because of this reason, but I don't know about the others. Some of them, for example, don't want to be seen borrowing too much under the name of the parent company, and they borrow under different names.
Okay, the ultimate rank, and then we will go to the right-hand side.
Domenico Conti of ANSA. Mr. Draghi, you mentioned several factors behind the stabilization of European economic and financial landscape. You didn't really stress the point of the firewall which has been prepared for Greece and more generally the European firewall. How do you judge the progress being made towards implemented this firewall for Greece? And second, do you see a sufficient progress towards building larger IMF resources against global instability at the next IMF meeting in April? Thank you.
Well, I think the two things are actually linked. the IMF has made quite clear that, or better, the some members of the IMF have made quite clear that they would be ready to commit more resources, to give more resources to the IMF general resource account, and indirectly to some of them to the euro area, only if an adequate firewall were in place. At the same time, the building of an adequate firewall has to take in consideration that there are, I don't know how many, but many different countries, many different governments, many different budgets situations. That's why it's taken so long. But in the European Council in December, at the beginning, December 9th, if I remember, and the European Council of the end of January, two things were basically restated. The first is that the EFSF resources adequacy would be reviewed in March. The second is that the ESM creation would be put forward to, I think it's June or May. And then there was a successive statement where it was said that the ESM would be recapitalized at a faster pace, capitalized actually, not recapitalized, capitalized at a faster pace than it had been originally stated. So all in all, one has to be confident that that the adequate efforts, though slowly, will bring to fruit. Actually, there will be an adequate firewall in place. And following that, I think we will be able to have the IMF resources in the general resource account.
Okay, let's go to the ultimate right-hand side, the lady. Yes, please.